Here we are, episode 27 of Prescription for Better Access podcast, here with my partner, Dr. Scott Howe. How are you, Scott?
Hey, Mark. It's great to see you. I'm doing really well, thanks. Today we're pleased to do another episode with the support of the Access Forum. And as you recall, they're a professional association, a society for market access professionals around the globe. And we're awfully glad to have their support and cooperation in putting together some of these programs. We will have more information on the forum in the show notes at the end for listeners that are interested. And as you and I know, we'll be joining them at their upcoming conference in Austin in June and hosting a plenary session.
Well, yeah, and I'm excited about that, to be up there hosting a session with where we talk about the future of prescription drugs, pricing, and access. So that'll be exciting. But today we have another important topic, and we get to dive in for a little bit deeper. We have a topic that for me is a little bit more, sort of cloudy. So I'm hoping that we can add some clarity to it and help people understand this very important topic of value, right?
Yeah.
And it's so important.
I agree. And we've already on the show, we've talked with a lot of industry leaders about how comparative effectiveness and cost effectiveness analyses are used to assess drug value. But as we know, that debate is far from settled. So today we're going to dive a little bit deeper on the techniques themselves. And we're joined by two world-class experts. Really pleased to have them with us. First, Lou Garrison, PhD. He's professor emeritus at the Comparative Health Outcomes Policy and Economics Institute at the University of Washington. Lou's also got a wealth of experience in the applied world, in addition to the academics as well. And then Dan Ollendorf, also PhD. He's the Chief Scientific Officer and Director of HTA Methods and Engagement at ICER. And Dan's got a wealth of experience in both the applied world and the academic world as well. So we're really fortunate to have two such great experts with us. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having us. Great to see you all. Great to see you, Lou.
Same here. Dan and I worked together 2 years ago in India trying to talk about how to improve HTA. So
yeah, good. Well, we'll pick it up here today, Lou.
Well, I know we're going to focus on the U.S., but just keep in mind there are 7 other billion people on Earth.
Well, and to help the 7 billion understand this topic, right? We've broken it down into some segments, so we're going to sort of use that as our transitions.
Sure.
And the first one I'm going to start with is defining value as it relates to prescription drugs. And maybe Lou, why don't you start with even what is the total cost of prescription drugs in the U.S. as a percent of sort of the healthcare spend that we have, and then we'll sort of go from there.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to do that. I did try to look up the numbers, and the important thing to emphasize is that, 30. I think that hospital spending is like 35 to 40%, and physician spending is 20%. Pharmaceuticals are 10 to 15%, depending on whether you're in a commercial plan or from a system-wide. It's a harder question than you think, to answer in our system because some of the medicines are in hospital costs. Some of them are over the, prescription pharmaceuticals. So I would just say roughly 10 to 15%. But the projections are that will remain relatively stable as a percentage because we constantly, we have drugs going off patent and they become generic. And so, the prices fall and then we come in with new medicine. So that's the projection that it'll still be 10 to 15% for the next 10 years. But that's, I don't know what, Dan, if you have a better, more detailed answer than that.
Well, I can certainly jump in. So I don't have any more detailed answers, but I do know that commercial health plans in particular are talking a lot about the pressures that drug pricing is putting on their margins, on their operating expenditures. So AHIP, which is the trade organization for commercial health plans, talks about numbers that are in the 20 to 25% range in terms of prescription drug contribution. And you're also hearing about challenging rate increases that have been filed in certain states with prescription drugs and other costs, provider pricing in particular, as the named culprit. So I think there are a number of challenges that the commercial space is feeling. And so I think the actual percentage is a little evasive, and it does differ by the type of payer, but obviously it's a substantial area of concern.
Yeah. And the other big challenge, of course, is even if as a percentage of total spending, it's been relatively flat for many decades, actually. The overall spending on healthcare has increased faster than GDP in our country for many decades as well, and which creates an affordability problem generally, for everyone, and which has become particularly more acute, as you guys are pointing out, in the private commercial markets here over the last few years, as we've had more and more cost shifting going from the public programs to the private payers as well. And so the employers
Right.
for sure are feeling the pain broadly in healthcare. Drugs are a part of that. And so they're part of the conversation.
We all feel those implications because at
Yeah,
the
exactly.
end of the day, we're paying for it in higher premiums or higher taxes, depending on who the payer is. It's happening to
Yep.
everybody.
Sure.
But we also will, again, everybody knows that, our backgrounds, at least the regular listeners know our background, and that, we work with, obviously, on the manufacturer side, bringing some of these great products to the market. And so, the value they bring to the market, obviously, is considerable. And so let's start with sort of defining, if we could, right? Like, how do the different stakeholders define value as they look at prescription drugs? I'll let either one, Lou or Dan, jump in.
Well, Lou, I kind of jumped in on the cost side. So why don't you start off with your thoughts about value?
I was a teaching assistant in Victor Fuchs's class at Stanford in 1975. Okay. So I've been doing this for 50 years. Okay. Still talking about this. And, and what did economists recommend for the last 50 years? That we should not subsidize rich people more through the tax system than poor people. Okay. And, McCain tried to deal with that. Obama tried to deal with that. We passed the Cadillac tax and we repealed it. So we're at 17 to 18% of GDP. The other developed nations are at 12%, right? So, we pay our doctors more, our hospitals more, and we pay higher drug prices than the rest of the world. So that's kind of the general setting. And I've worked in nonprofit research for 12 years. Then I worked in the pharmaceutical industry for 12 years, and I've been in academia, but consulting for the last 20 years. So in terms of value, economists have their concept of value, which is basically thinking with the usual economic model. We start with a well-functioning market, and we say the value of something is what people are willing to pay for it, right? And everybody's valuations are different, but because it's a market and demand and supply, we get an equilibrium price. So some people are getting consumer surplus at the current price. So they might be willing to pay $50 for a shirt, but they get it for 20. So I would say that economic GDP doesn't measure that. The happiness research people measure how happy are you because you're getting things at low cost. And now what I would then say, okay, now think about Google Earth. How much would I have been willing to pay for Google Earth as an app on my computer? Well, the richest person in the world couldn't have had Google Earth in the year 2000. It didn't exist. And I'm sure if I were a billionaire, I would have said, I would love to have an app that would let me go all over the world on a street in Shanghai and look at the houses. Okay. So I think let's not forget consumer surplus and value. So value is kind of willingness to pay. That's one measure, but when you pay, that means you're giving up money that you could use for something else. So we call that opportunity cost. So in a static sense, most organizations have fixed annual budgets, and they're trying to maximize their return, maximize the well-being of their patient population. So but that's a short-term perspective. Now, I like to quote Joe Newhouse's article from in the year 2000 about Medicare pricing. When it comes to drugs, they're a unique segment of this. Medicine's unique because of uncertainty and through all the things. But medicines are unique because that information is a global public good. Therefore, we have a patent system to then incentivize long-term. So we're not just taking a static view. We really want optimal innovation, which is dynamic efficiency. And so Joe Newhouse said, that the patent system is an effort to approximate a dynamically efficient price. And I would just say, this is the case. We have an airplane in flight, and we're making adjustments. all the time, and it's not working perfectly. But we're producing a lot of medicine that save lives, but then the costs are going up. So we can come back to those. But so value is some combination of willingness to pay and opportunity costs. But I think the thing we need to think about is we're dropping a new technology into a healthcare system. It affects individual patients, it affects their loved ones, it affects schools, it affects the whole economy. So we want to look at that marginal benefit of dropping it in and the marginal cost. So that's it. Well, that's all of Economics 101. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Lou.
It's good. And so just expand on that a little bit then do you think that view is sort of universally held and understood, or do different constituents, think about different things, Lou? Patients, for example, or advocacy groups, manufacturers, and so on.
You can think of each actor, each stakeholder having their own perspective. So and we've assigned a role to the FDA. We've said, we want you to think about the clinical benefits versus the risk.
Yeah.
Let us know if it should be on the market. That's what we've asked. That's their role. So to me, it's like, the world's a stage, everybody's got a role, and we're in this complicated ecosystem. Now, in our field, we kind of graduate up from individual stakeholders to, okay, let's look at the health sector perspective, or let's look at the societal perspective. Let me stop there and let Dan amend and improve that comment.
Thanks, Lou. And so it is important to really have this grounding. And but I think despite the fact that I inhabit the world of health economics, as it's applied to health technology assessment, I try to think about value in terms of the ultimate end consumer. So that is the patient. This is the patient that's going to potentially benefit from the innovation that we're trying to foster. And so what do patients think about? What do patients and their caregivers think about? They think about the potential for a new drug or any other health technology to lengthen their life, if it's a life-shortening condition they're dealing with, and or improve the quality of life, make them feel better. So at the core, and I think, Lou, you and I can agree that these are the sort of the core tenets of what would be considered value from the patient perspective. And then, of course, the challenge, and in some cases, the methodologic approach, has to be about what is the right level of investment for that benefit that the patient will get from the drug. I'm sure that we'll talk about this, but there are, given the difference in perspective that Lou alluded to, the health sector perspective versus a broader societal perspective, other things may play a role as well. Other elements may play a role as well, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But at the core, what do we really want out of a drug? We want it to have us live longer and have that longer life be a better quality of life, right?
Well, absolutely. And
let me. Can I comment?
Oh, sure, absolutely.
We're all going to be patients someday. I mean, I'm probably taking 5 different medicines. I'm age 75. I'm looking at my life table. Okay, so So, and I agree with Dan. And I did an analysis for Medicare in 1980. Should they cover heart transplantation in the elderly? Right. I did a cost per QALY analysis, and I've done many cost per QALY analyses, cost utility. Now, I would just say broadly, that's what economists would call a cost benefit analysis. But the fundamental thing is, because we're insured, we're not really voting with our own dollars. So willingness to pay doesn't work so well. So I think the whole framework that Dan is talking about and that we've both used over the years is an attempt to approximate kind of willingness to pay in this particular market. It works fine here. It doesn't work as well in education or criminal justice. But cost benefit is the basic idea: marginal benefit versus marginal costs. I had another thought, but it'll come back to me. So let me be quiet.
But on that, if I could though, on that willingness to pay, because for me, this is where, like, it gets down to the real world, right? Which is, even just this week, Novo Nordisk came out with a new pharmacy that they're launching, where you could get access to their, GLP-1 for half the price. It's all cash, but it's half the price. And people are gobbling, Lilly's doing the Lilly Direct program, gobbling it up. So people are willing to pay for the things that they want, but there's a lot of feedback and flack about the cost of drugs, for other things that, like you said, where other potential people are paying for it. How do we balance this sort of willingness to pay with the cost benefit analysis?
Yeah, I want to come back to just one other point, and if I forget this, your question, I tend to think of it as that not so much patient-centric, since we're all going to be patients, it's people-centric or person-centric, and Denmark looks at it this way. So I look at it like I go back to 2020, say end of 2019. If you said what was my quality of life, it was pretty good. Come March of 2020, and I'm being told that COVID is out there, and there's a chance that I'll die in the next 3 months, and there's not a good chance that we'll have a vaccine. So my utility level fell. I was much worse off, and I wasn't a patient, but once we had announced that mRNA vaccines worked, I was better off, even if I never got COVID. So I think we have what we call that insurance value. It's the peace of mind that people get from knowing that something can be done, even if they're not a patient at the moment. That's
Yep.
extremely valuable, okay? And that's what the enhancements that we've done in the value flower and a task force that we have at ISPOR has emphasized the value in the other people, and not only if you have a loved one with Alzheimer's, you're worse off. So there are all these complicated interactions when you take a broader perspective. Now, we don't know how to value those and how much to reward the companies for them, but we want to recognize those. So, Mark, what was your question again?
And I can jump in just specifically around the issue that you raised, Mark. And I think that we have to be careful because willingness to pay sounds like sort of a very clear and understandable term, but it's the way that we think about it is a bit different than the example you're providing. So you're talking about this announcement from Novo and the Lilly Direct program. You're really talking about an individual's willingness to cough up their own cash to receive this innovation. When we think about willingness to pay, we think about that as applied to cost effectiveness thresholds, for example. We're really talking about the level at which those opportunity costs that Lou mentioned don't exceed the investment that you're willing to make. So if you're making a new investment, are you doing that investment in a way that does not displace other interventions, the use of other interventions to the extent that you're eroding health at the population level? So we're thinking about this at a broad population level. So what is the right level of investment that will be appropriate to receive this health gain from this new treatment? And that level of appropriateness is directly tied to how much health would be displaced by making the investment itself. So are you not able to do certain things because that investment is too great for the benefit received? Or in a commercial insurance market, will you have disenrollment from the plan because of premium increases that are too great because of the investment you're making? That's how we think about willingness to pay at the population level. But Lou, please chime in.
Well, let me just say there's some economists like the term stylized facts, which is are basically generalizations we need to keep in mind. And one of them is that 5% of the people spend 50% of the money in a given year. Okay. And I think I looked it up, their average spending is like $71,000, whereas average spending in general is $15,000 per person, which is a lot if you think about it over a lifetime. That's like giving you a lifetime budget of 1.2 million, 15,000 times 80 years. I mean, so we're going to spend a lot of money. Now, I worked on Secretary Bowen's catastrophic plan in 1988 that was repealed. And that was when we were just getting some good medicines, and we said, Medicare should cover medicines. It didn't cover medicines before that. And then we said, the first principle of insurance is we should cover catastrophic losses. That's
Right.
why people have insurance, to get peace of mind and protection from financial ruin, right? And so we started that, and it got repealed because we had income-related premiums. Now we have income-related premiums. I pay them, but we repealed it. Now, but the point is, that was a catastrophe. Now, when every person, when 75% of the people are obese and overweight, it's not a rare condition. It's not that insurable. You can't ask the 20% of unobese people to cover the costs for the obese. So the GLP-1s bring a big problem to a system like ours because, we all could, a lot of people can benefit. We can't afford it at a high, at the kind of prices that we often have. So, Yeah, what are we observing? We're observing tremendous competition, driving them down so that they can even become available. I mean, there's competition there, and I have a paper on Hep C drugs that fell from 50 in 1950 in 2015. They fell from $55,000 a year with competition to $14,000 a year. Well, it's a very different proposition at a population level when the price is 14,000 instead of 50,000. And I think we're going to have the same thing with the GLP-1s because of competition. I mean, they weren't insurable at the initial prices for everybody with obesity, but gradually we're getting access. Now, I would say, well, so it's a complicated airplane in flight. How much money should we reward Novo Nordisk versus these others? And we have a kind of a decentralized crude system for doing that. But, that's kind of where we're at.
Okay, awesome. All right, so I got to say, like, the value conversation is complicated, but I'm glad we have people like you, thinking about this stuff and able to, kind of keep it straight and all. Could we turn now maybe to the role of health technology assessment and cost effectiveness analysis within this domain? Could you help us understand sort of what those are, where they came from, why we have them, that kind of thing to start?
Well, health technology assessment it's not a new method. It's not a new approach. Some of your listeners might be surprised to find out that it was born on these very shores. Health technology assessment was first realized through efforts like the Office of Technology Assessment in the U.S., the National Center for Healthcare Technology. And so the methods and the approach taken really had their start here. For a variety of political reasons, we don't have to get into the details on this podcast, those efforts went away. And then Western Europe first, and then other parts of the world started to adopt these methods and utilize them thereafter. So beginning really in the mid to late 90s and then continuing on, we've seen formal health technology assessment organizations or agencies that have been created in these countries. So, and the reason for HTA, and some HTAs do not use cost effectiveness, but many do, is really to, again, think about the benefit that is being realized for a product that will have received regulatory approval, but there are still uncertainties in the data, questions about how it will be used in comparison to alternatives that might already exist in the armamentarium. And for those settings that do consider it, whether the investment required, whether the price that's being requested is worth it in terms of the value being brought by the drug. So it really is an attempt to be a principled and methods-driven approach to considering new investments in health. It doesn't necessarily focus entirely on quantitative analysis. Yes, there is cost effectiveness, but there's also typically deliberation on the evidence by an independent committee of experts and patient and consumer representatives who review the evidence themselves and then come to some shared judgment about the investment. So it is obviously a field, just like health economics, that continues to evolve, but I think it's here to stay as more of a principled and centralized way to make decisions. Now in the US, because there is no formal government entity doing this work, ICER has really tried to step into that breach and do this from a private sector perspective, provide the information. Stakeholders are free to use the information as they see fit.
Mm-hmm. And how did HTA become standard practice in Europe and elsewhere, and why is the U.S. approach different?
Well, I think for a variety of reasons, it became a standard approach in Europe because there was this concern not only about whether there could be a principled way to consider the evidence on a new technology, drugs, devices, what have you, and to understand what the right level of payment would be for that new incentive or that new innovation, but also in some settings, because those decisions weren't being made in a centralized way historically. So let's say in England, for example, you had something that was described as the postcode lottery, which meant that where you lived and based on the decisions made by the local health council, that then led to whether or not you had access to a new treatment. That wasn't felt to be fair because HTA is really about the principle of distributive justice, right? You want to be able to make something available to the entire population if the investment's considered worth it. So those are really the driving forces behind why that's happened in Europe. Here we have a very decentralized system, a very confusing system. There is no one single arbiter or payer for treatment. And so you have lots of different decisions being made at lots of different levels, and that's probably the major contributing factor.
Yeah, let me jump in with just a reminder about a few more stylized facts. Okay. One is the drug, as Kenneth Arrow wrote in 1963, this uncertainty is the most pervasive characteristic of this whole endeavor. Insurance, uncertainty about product quality, uncertainty about your health, uncertainty whether you'll benefit from taking a drug, just, a lot of uncertainty. And so at the same time, but 9 out of 10 in drug development, 9 out of 10 drugs fail in development. Very uncertain. I worked at Syntex. We went out of business because we didn't come up with a blockbuster. Roche bought us, right? So, it's dynamic and it's not a fixed thing. So we've decentralized those decisions. The other thing is information is a global public good. Everybody can potentially benefit from science. Not only the science of how the drug works, but the science of real world evidence. How does it work in the real world? The market fails. We don't supply enough real world evidence, hence all the interest. So if you're a patient, it's hard to find good data on 10 years of follow-up on your drug, right? So those are failures. And how do we deal with that? Well, we have a patent system. We have Hatch-Waxman. We give people the power to be a monopolist or an oligopolist for a short time. They make it a big prize. Lipitor, Pfizer got like $150 billion over the year for that prize. Humira got even over $200 billion. And yet, what does it cost to develop the drugs? Well, we produce about 50 a year. Last year was 50. Pretty flat. We spent about $300 billion. So it's costing us on average billions, $6 billion or more to produce these medicines. So we have this winner take all. If you strike oil, you get the big return. But the other thing is we finance probably 50 to 60% of the global R&D in America. We're the wealthiest country, and economists would say for global public goods, rich people should contribute more than poor people. Now, we have differential pricing across countries. So these other countries negotiate with HTA to get a lower price. And then within the U.S., we have different prices for Medicare, Medicaid, VA. I mean, we have differential pricing. So we are contributing different amounts to this global public good. And that's right. It's just the question is, how well is the system working? Now, Dan and I wrote a white paper with some colleagues at USC a few years ago, and we were struggling with the change in administration, what should happen in HTA? And the consensus was this information is a global public good. And what ICER does and other similar organizations, by accumulating the evidence and distributing that evidence about how the drug works, what we know at launch, that's valuable. Everybody should have that. But I would say that group was reluctant to say that we should have a centralized negotiation in a complicated system where we have all these, I sit on a P&T committee and a health plan with 2 million people. Mm-hmm. We have a P&T committee. We do all the kind of things that ICER does. We even use ICER reports. And then we have a side of the organization that is in this competitive market of PBMs and so on, which has its flaws. But there's price negotiation going on. And guidelines are constantly adjusting as we get new information. And we do have a dynamic and reactive system in this country for that reason.
Right. Well, if I could turn to the next big category, which is around diving into some of those challenges around sort of drug value assessments, right? And, Dan, I know ICER's, as you said, sort of stepped in. Lou, you mentioned the ISPOR's value flower. Help us understand, what are the challenges around assessing the value of prescription drugs? Challenges or controversies around assessing the value of prescription drugs?
Well, why don't we let Dan, you start first, because ICER, we had this core, which is cost utility analysis, the cost per QALY. And then we gradually refined and improved that. And ICER is constantly trying to revise methods. And then I can talk about what our task force said. And The latest version of the value flower, which is called generalized CEA.
Let me just jump in with an addendum to Lou's last comment about this effort that we were both part of that was moderated by USC. So while there was a reluctance to think about the idea of a central party negotiating prices based on cost effectiveness or other HTA elements, there was interest in having the federal government support a national coordinating center that could kind of be a standards and methods body. And then other groups like ICER and other organizations could be essentially part of that network. So I think that even that group recognized that the absence of a national entity that could help set directions has been a real challenge for the US. So that's just an addendum to the last comment. In terms of value assessment and the challenges associated with value assessment, I think really at the core, ICER as Lou said, is always an interested party to learn about developments in academic research, to understand what sort of proposed changes to methods or optimization of methods might be suggested. It's one of the major reasons we've recently stood up a working group, an international working group of health economics experts called the Health Economics Methods Advisory, to really help us, provide us independent advice on what these novel methods mean for HTA, what the challenges are, what the potential benefits are, what sort of implementation issues we should be thinking about. And so we really view this as a way to accelerate the natural discourse and vetting that happens in the academic world when new methods are proposed. So we are always interested parties. I think that the challenge in thinking about whether you're talking about a broader perspective, like going from health sector to societal, or you're thinking about including other potential elements of value, like in generalized CEA, the challenge, because we are thinking about the work that we do is primarily informing healthcare decision-making. And you guys know, because you've interacted with, and I think one of you's even worked in the payer space before, that the medical loss ratio governs everything, right? So commercial health plans are primarily tasked with paying for health services. And so if there are methods that are suggesting higher prices because there are 6 or 7 different other elements of value that don't really affect health, but other things, that's going to be a real challenge for a payer to think about when they're trying to pay for health innovations. So that's one of the issues. I think that, so we really need to think very carefully as an HTA organization about how we consider value, what elements of value should automatically inflate the price, potentially, and what elements of value may be a strong consideration from an adoption perspective. Like, we have a high cost therapy in a rare disease where there's literally nothing else available. We may want to make a special exception in a situation like that. Or we have a therapy like GLP-1s, for example, we've already talked about those already, that are highly cost effective from an individual patient standpoint, but raise a significant budget impact concern. And so then we think about how do we actually manage the introduction or the extension of use of those kinds of therapies. So I think there are other considerations that we have to take into account when we're thinking about value, because at the end of the day, we're trying to inform health decisions by organizations that are paying for health.
Yeah, no, I would, great comments, Dan. I think just, Dan did talk about the need for centralized information. And I will say that Victor Fuchs, my mentor, and Alan Garber and Zeke Emanuel wrote a paper 20 years ago saying we should have this HTA body that produces information for the market, right? Because it's going to be undersupplied by the private market, and ICER and Dan and colleagues really helped to fill that gap. So
I have a practical question related to this stuff. Many of the times that I've been involved inside of companies, thinking about, our own cost effectiveness analysis as we're preparing to launch a medicine, thinking about value and pricing and all those sorts of things, that the clinical trial data that was derived for use by the FDA, Lou, as you pointed out, to to judge safety and efficacy, oftentimes doesn't answer all the questions about the value impact. And so then there's a whole set of assumptions that need to be made, and then it gets controversial about those assumptions and so on. Is that sort of circumstance generally the rule, or not? And what, if anything, should we all do about that?
No, that's generally the rule. Okay, and I do. Remind me to come back to the cost effectiveness threshold that Dan is raising. But no, my wife is a CLL patient. She's had CLL for 10 years. She's on the third line of therapy now because of progress during this period in the BTK inhibitor, second generation, BTK inhibitor. So that's part of it. I mean, I think that is an important part of the technological innovation is important. Now, and you're talking about, we build cost effectiveness models, but then we also go out and, to come back to your point, I mean, her treatment decisions are based on trials in 600 Germans. When she started on obinutuzumab, the only data was, we did a trial in 600 Germans and it worked. Okay, that was it. Now there are probably hundreds of thousands of people who've taken that medicine. And the point is, we don't collect good real world data. There's a tremendous market failure. And so, she's generating biomarker data every 3 months, and, where's it going? I mean, hopefully we're going to do that. But no, I mean, you've got to understand that, Dan and ICER are handicapped, and they're said, okay, given this pivotal trial, which is only an efficacy versus risk, it's not effectiveness. We use the term effectiveness to mean real world. So those launch things, all projections of from efficacy, what effectiveness might be for a typical individual in the trial. Then we see, it's obvious there's all this literature on heterogeneity. People in the trial are not representative of all the people who are going to get it. So the real world effectiveness is going to go into tens of thousands of people, very different conditions, and it's not going to be the same as the trial. And that's why you kind of want a dynamic system that lets you adjust as we learn what works, and then renegotiate prices on an ongoing basis.
And how should all of our thinking about these assessments and value generally relate to market access and patient access for the medicines as well? Does our system do that well or not, do you think?
I wish.
Dan, I know ICER, has made some efforts thinking about this and trying to measure even. And we talked to Sarah, and it sounds like, progress, but, there's some difficulties still.
Yeah. And so we really want to talk about we often talk about the level and the level of responsibility that the major stakeholders have in this system. So if there's general agreement that a new therapy is priced according to its value, a value-based price, that should translate into easy access in the health plan world. And I think we see challenges on both sides. We see challenges because there are prices that are high for therapies that are of significant value, and also therapies that are not. And on the payer side, we see restrictions on access for therapies that are maybe of questionable value, and also the same restrictions on access for therapies of very high value. So I think both sides of the equation are really challenging and are being challenged, I think, by those behaviors. And so if those two pillars are in place, or at least are embraced more broadly, then that's the seed of innovation, in our view. That if you commit to value-based pricing and you're rewarded by patient access, then those are the kinds of innovations we actually want to see moving forward.
But then if I could, before we turn to the sort of our looking to the future category, I just want to take that concept one step further, because Lou, you mentioned cost effectiveness thresholds as well. So how do we apply those cost effectiveness sort of thresholds more broadly? Because drugs get a lot of focus, a lot of attention, but what about hospitals? What about medical procedures? What about physician services? Like, how do we bring, nobody's sitting there and evaluating whether my buddy's who's an orthopedic surgeon is doing a good job with knee replacements. He is, by the way. He's the best in the area. But my point is that there's nobody.
You have the knees to show for it.
Well, we have nobody knows how many
Yeah.
knee replacements were done last week, but everybody can tell you how many prescriptions were sold last week, right? So help me understand, how do we take the cost effectiveness thresholds and look at it more broadly?
I want to make a general point about the threshold. So, as I said, I've done cost utility, look at the health gains, length of life, quality of life, and cost offsets. But then I think that the point of our ISPOR task force is we were really not taking account of uncertainty and the risk aversion. And so we weren't we were just counting the benefits in the patients, not in the population who is at risk. And so, which you see in the real world, for rare catastrophic conditions, I'm willing to pay more per life year than for common conditions. And we see the UK and other countries adopting those adjusters. So the intuition is, if you said to me, of all the value elements, yes, I want to worry about genericization. Yes, I want to worry about real option value. Yes, I want to worry about equity. What's the most important one? I want to be able to pay more, my representative, for things that are more important. So I don't want to have a fixed threshold. I want to have a variable threshold. And if I had to add one thing to the cost per QALY, because I can cover a lot of ground by a willingness to pay, taking into account all of these other factors. Like in COVID, getting my grandchildren back to school. Okay, that didn't, but things like that we need, we need to think about. Now, HTA mark applies to everything, and if you go back to Office of Technology Assessment, they do. Now, you may be surprised to learn the government has a circular that says what is the value of a life, and it's like $8 to $10 million, and they apply it to highways. In theory, it's applied to every regulation that the government does. They're supposed to do a cost-benefit analysis of, do a cost-benefit analysis of the regulation. Now, the current administration, I think, wants to get rid of that for whatever reason, but that's been there for many, many years. So we do apply it outside of just this narrow realm. It's just they do it differently, but it's still fundamentally a cost-benefit analysis.
Yeah, and before coming back to ICER, I spent time in academia at Tufts, which maintains a registry of about 15,000 published cost-effectiveness analyses. And there are many analyses on non-drug topics. So the questions have been asked and evaluated. I think the reason why drug cost-effectiveness analysis predominates is that this is a patent-protected development, a patent-protected innovation. And so during the period of patent protection, interested parties want to understand what is the value of the investment we're potentially making in this therapy. So I think there's a very good reason for why those analyses happen, but it's certainly worthwhile given the trend in higher costs for everything in health to understand whether those other products, services, devices are worth the investment as well.
Mm-hmm.
If ICER was 20 times the size, we'd be looking at those topics too.
Yeah, right.
Sarah Emont made a very interesting comment in her podcast with you. And she started out in genetics, and she said, if you'd said to me 25 years ago when I started that we would have CRISPR and we would have all these gene therapies, I would have said there's no way in my lifetime. Yeah. So I'll go back to that Sarah and ask her, well, how much would you be willing to invest over the next 25 years to have those things?
Yeah.
And now we know that, we approve 50 drugs a year. Now half of them are orphan conditions, and it's the economics. You have a small population too. So, but you could say, well, we have potentially people talk about 6,000 to 7,000 genetic diseases, and about 10% of the population is going to get them. We don't have the treatments yet, but we're all at risk of having children or grandchildren or our own selves having those genetic diseases. And we would like to have something available to deal with them if that happens.
Okay. Let's turn a little bit to the future. So Dan pointed out the logic of operating in a world where fair pricing is met with fair access, I'll say. And I think, as you guys know, I've been a proponent of that for a long time. But we're not there, as we know. And he described the misbehaviors, I'll say, on both sides. I can vouch certainly from the manufacturer side that if you launch a medicine into the market at a fair price, at a low price with price moderation, there is no assurance that you're going to be rewarded. In fact, I would say the experience of the industry is just the opposite, that you're going to be, managed just as hard as you would have been otherwise. And as Lou pointed out earlier, the industry economics do work on kind of like this prize sort of thing. What I always say is like, you make your money where you can, while you can, is the way it goes. Because some things you're going to be able to charge more for, others that maybe have high value you can't, and so you just do what you make your money where you can. But all that seems irrational, and especially in a world where patient deductibles are going up and coinsurance is higher and higher, and it's tied to list prices, not net prices, and all those things. It just feels like it creates a level of distortion in the system. So is there hope that we can police ourselves better and we can find our way to a more rational construct that might be closer to fair prices for fair access, do you think? Or is this all in vain?
Scott, I think you accurately described the U.S. health system as the pinball machine that it is.
Yes,
lots
right.
lots of different bumpers and holes and unseen obstacles in the way. And so it is really challenging to think about whether this just sort of simple calculus of fair pricing and fair access can actually be realized. And we know that there is a lot of attention paid because of the way things operate in the commercial space to the entire rebate discussion. This is all about the PBM rebate. Rebate is king. Value matters less. You're starting to see people laid off in HEOR departments in the U.S. affiliates of these companies for that very reason. And it's very, very sad to me that this is happening. So I think the hope would be if there's a way, if Congress obviously is dealing with lots of things right now. If PBM reform actually does happen, that may be one way to try to accelerate the idea. But even if it doesn't, if there are ways to support the disruptive PBMs that are actually doing the work to try to understand the possibilities around a value-based formulary, then those should be supported. And if those are successful experiments, then those experiments should be amplified.
Yeah, let me just add, again, I go back to still have 27 million uninsured people, okay? And that's not only is it a shame, national disgrace, but what does it mean? It means that they're at risk of bankruptcy. Now, we have a law that they have to be treated in the hospital, but they don't get the same level of treatment if they were insured. So, I want those people brought into the system. We should have universal health coverage. It doesn't make sense to have high co-payments and deductibles for people who are catastrophically ill. And we said 50% of the people, 5% have 50% of the spending at $71,000 a year. So I don't want those people having to worry about co-pays and deductibles. I want a system that takes the best care we can of them, So I think we have to think about that as well. Now, so I would worry about universal health coverage. I would try to limit the tax subsidy because it does create a distortion. As you say, we have lots of distortion. So if I'm a 55-year-old and I'm working, my employer says to me, you can get $1,000 worth of health insurance coverage for, say, $700, and it would cover your knee replacement if you need it. Would you like that? I say, sure. If I can buy $1,000 worth of something for $700, I'll go for it. And so that's the marginal person in the system is the 55 to 60-year-old who's still an employer fan, who's at greater risk of illness than the younger people who wants this thing. And we say, we'll give you a deal. And then we find ourselves doing knee replacements in 95-year-old people with Alzheimer's disease. Okay. So we have a lot of problems in managing that. Now, Dan and I struggle with, to what extent should we have a centralized assessment like the UK and these others? And, I worked with the CMS people, the HCFA people on Bowen's plan. They're dedicated government employees trying to solve the problem. But imagine under the current situation that you have to negotiate with Donald Trump and Elon Musk with your drug price, not Shahala or somebody. Okay. I think that's what makes economists cautious about centralized negotiation, because it creates all kinds of other incentive issues. So that's an argument for staying with our imperfect decentralized approach and trying to improve it and not go to centralized national drug negotiation like other countries do.
Well, this sort of brings us to our final question, and I think you've both sort of covered it, so it's okay to pass on this one as well. But, we ask all of our guests, what is their prescription for better access? And I know that, in this context, we're talking about designing an ideal system that could reward drug innovation at the same time, give fair access at the same time, be value-based approach. So help us. Is there anything else you want to add in terms of like your prescription for better access?
I mean, I think I had three elements I'll quickly mention. One is let's think broadly at a societal level about the impacts and try to trace those out and think about the peace of mind you get from knowing that something is available. Let's really change the way we do deductibles and copays and insure people who have catastrophic illness, and then let's make sure that we're addressing the people who don't have coverage. Those would be three things, and I think that would help with access.
Yeah, and so I think I agree with Lou on those points. With the first point, I would, as I sounded before, I would sound the cautionary note that we can think broadly about the potential benefits of treatment, but we don't have to quantify everything in a simple equation. We can deliberate on some of those aspects and talk about the potential for outsized benefit in some populations, but it doesn't mean that we have to translate everything into the price given the struggles that are happening in the system. I know in previous podcasts you've talked about this last question as if you had a magic wand, what would you wave it at? And I want to pick up on Lou's point. I think that if I had a magic wand, I would keep the employer-sponsored structure and eliminate the tax subsidy, because then everybody understands all of the competing demands and concerns. Right now, if a self-insured employer has a massive increase in healthcare costs and they can write it off on their taxes, they're not going to be as concerned as you want them to be.
Right.
So to get all actors in the system to really be able to manage the system and manage the costs in an equitable way, that would be one way to do it.
Well, Alan Enthoven, proposed, 50 years ago, Consumer Choice Health Plan, and we see, like competing Medicare. That's been our solution: have competing Medicare Advantage plans.
Yeah.
And within a market system, that's what we've done. But I will tell you, it's a lot different being a 25-year-old choosing health plans and a 75-year-old saying, I don't want to waste any time having to think about this. I don't have that much time left. Do I want to spend it reading brochures from 5 different health plans? Not particularly. So that's a problem, okay? And not only that, I may progress to Alzheimer's, and then my choices will be even worse. Okay, so that's a problem. It's a challenge, interesting one. But I think we're on the same page. Economists have said let's get rid of the marginal tax subsidy, even though health is important and we should subsidize health. But I would also go back to, let's not forget, one of the things that we did in our value flyer was equity. In the 5 years since then, there's been tremendous work on health equity that as an element. And we've talked about, okay, but that all stems back to fundamental income and wealth inequality. Okay. And we got to deal with that at a broad societal level because that affects everything else.
Well, I think that's a great transition because I think that could be its own podcast at some point, its own episode.
Absolutely.
So with that, let me say thank you to Dan and Lou for joining us. Obviously, very important topic as we shared. Scott, you want to sort of take what are some of your takeaways? And we're close on time, so I'm respectful. We might be a little briefer this time.
Okay. Well, it's a great reminder of why I always enjoy spending time with economists. I think they reminded us that while these topics are complicated and these methodologies are complicated and the data is complicated and all that, there are standards, there are well-established processes. Other people are using these and they're using them to a certain effectiveness. And there's a logic to all of this. I like that it, in some ways, kind of comes back again to fair prices for fair access. And I like these notions about universal health coverage, the tax subsidy, and broadening our sense of value and sort of the peace of mind of knowing something might exist. So I think a lot of great lessons here, and it was a good reminder why I like learning from economists.
Well, we learned as well. Thank you.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Thanks, guys.
And I think from my point of view, one big takeaway is the fact that real world evidence should be a bigger focus for us.
Yeah.
Like, why are we not taking all of the data for every patient that's on a drug out of their iPhone or their Oura Ring or whatever, their Apple Watch or whatever they're doing, and going into a database? Because, people always talk about that side effect. Oh, what are the side effects? What are the side effects? Well, like Lou said, when you test it in 600 patients and you see incredible results, and it's for a drug, it's for something like CLL, like you got to get that drug to market because it's going to save lives,
Sure.
right? So when you get into the broader population, what are some of the sort of areas that obviously there could be other issues to tackle? So for us, I do hope we invest more in real world evidence. That's a big takeaway from today.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you again to Lou and Dan for joining us. Important discussion, and also thank you to Scott for being my co-host, and thank you all to all of our listeners for joining us for another episode of Prescription for Better Access. And as always, if you have ideas or comments or things that we could do to get better, please let us know and send us a note at comments@prescriptionforbеттeraccess.com. Thank you, everybody.